We're going to step into Jesus' teachings, and we've been in a section where themes like what we saw in the Psalm of God's kingdom, and also themes of humility, really kind of like reframing our focus on what life is really about. That's been what Jesus has been speaking with his disciples on recently, because he's headed up to Jerusalem, and he's about a week and a half or so away from his arrest, trial, crucifixion, eventual burial, resurrection. This is coming close. So Jesus is trying to impart to his students all the things that are most near to his heart and things that they're going to need for the rest of their lives as followers of him. And so these are really crucial things for them, but they're also really crucial things for us to get our minds around as well. And our passage today is found in Matthew 20, verses 17 to 28. And just to give you a little context, if you're just here with us this morning, what we've been in the last couple of weeks, first of all, Jesus, he has encountered this very rich, very wealthy, very young, very powerful individual. And he's given that individual an option. You can hold on to all of your luxurious lifestyle, or you can set it aside and you can have treasure in heaven and you can follow me. And for this man, that was asking a little bit too much. And on the heels of that story, he told another story about an owner who decided to pay a day's wages to all of these laborers that he hired to go out and work in his vineyard. The only problem was some of those workers only had to work 1 hour, and others of them were hired at 6 o'clock in the morning, and they worked a full 12-hour shift out in the field, and they bore the burden of the work and the heat of the day. And Jesus was teaching his students about how in God's kingdom, things operate a little bit differently. The people who are concerned about their own interests tend to be the people who are kind of last. And the people who are willing to humble themselves tend to be the people that God lifts up. And so it's a whole different economy in God's kingdom. And so after this, Jesus is going to make a statement. It's the first verse that we interact with today. And he's going to say, I've been teaching you these things about how the first will be last, and the last people, they'll be the ones that are lifted up and honored. But I'm going to set the example myself. And I'm going to do it in an extreme way. It starts out while going up to Jerusalem. Just to give you a little context to this passage, what's happening. I've got 3 maps, and I want you to take a look at those really quickly. So if you can see, I know the map is a little bit small because it's on the screen behind me, but there's a red line that is across the right side of this map. And if you see that red line, there's a green line, a white line through the center, and a red line on the right side. And all those are different travel routes from Galilee down to Jerusalem. And you see, this is Passover time. And so Jesus is traveling, and they've taken the red route that crosses the Jordan River, goes out into what's present-day country of Jordan, the route that you see on the right. They're following that down. They're about ready to cross back over the Jordan River and head to the city of Jericho, where you can go to the next slide. It's going to be a long uphill climb. This is what the Jordan Rift Valley looks like. You can see the blue in the middle. A lot of those areas are almost 1,000 feet below sea level. And then you see the orange areas, which are the mountain peaks. And the ones that are on the left are the mountains that Jerusalem is in. And so here's the last slide for just reference. They're down in the valley, and they're about to climb up to the peak of that, to the city of Jerusalem, by foot. And so they've got quite a hike ahead of them. If you've been to Zion National Park, it's about like hiking from the valley up to the rim of that cliff, only it's about a 20-mile journey. And so they're walking, and it's not just Jesus and his followers. You can go to the next slide if you want as well. It's not just Jesus and his followers. It's a whole caravan of people going from Galilee. Some of the disciples' families are there, probably wives if they're married, kids. Definitely James and John's mother is traveling with them. And so it's a whole caravan of people headed up to celebrate Passover in Jerusalem. And that's where this conversation comes out of. And while they're traveling in this caravan, Jesus pulls his 12 over for a private conversation, and he says this. He says, look, we're going up to Jerusalem. They're going up because, again, it's uphill, like 3,500 feet up. They're traveling to Jerusalem. And he says the Son of Man, or the Son of Human, literally, is going to be handed over to the chief priests and scribes. They're going to condemn him to death. And he's talking about himself. They're going to hand him over to the Gentiles who are going to mock him and flog him with whips and crucify him. And on the 3rd day, he's going to be wakened. And this is still kind of mysterious, a little bit enigmatic to his disciples. They know he's been talking about his death, but they don't really grasp how everything could really, really be true that Jesus is telling them. But he's saying, I'm going to set the supreme example of what it means to be last. I'm going to go last, so you've got a great example to follow in my footsteps. And I think we could summarize what we're about to learn about today, perhaps with these 3 words. Leaders go last, which is totally contrary to the way that our society thinks. I had one idea of leadership growing up, and then about 15 years ago, I was forced to completely rethink my ideas about leadership. And this is a situation that brought me to that, I guess, different conclusion. I was a youth pastor, and I would lead groups of teenagers oftentimes on hikes in Zion National Park. And as soon as we got to the trailhead, oftentimes I would have interns with me, and then we would have our older students, our 17, 18-year-olds in the youth group. And for them, the idea of leading is that you just blaze a trail. You start off at breakneck speed, and you're out in front, and that's what leading is, because you're out there, and everybody can follow you until you leave them in the dust, 15 minutes later. But that's what leading is, getting out in front so people can maybe follow you or maybe try to keep up. But I was taught through those experiences that leadership is something quite different. Because as those people's bodies and dust clouds just flew out of sight, somebody had to wait around for the students whose pace was a lot slower. Somebody had to hike with the students who chose to wear flip-flops to walk through canyons and hike through the Narrows, through the river. And some people had to stay with the students who probably hadn't exercised for a long period of time but chose to hike a 7.5-mile round-trip trail up to Observation Point with 2,500 feet of elevation gain and loss on the way back down, who also happened to be wearing flip-flops. This is true. Or the people who were just young, or the people who were just left behind by everybody else in the group. And through those experiences, I was reminded that leadership oftentimes is actually slowing down my pace to walk beside that one person who's at the back. Sometimes it's actually intentionally missing out on the final destinations and the majestic views to ensure that everybody makes it back and everybody has somebody to hike with and somebody to talk with along the way. Going first is more fun, but going last is more loving, and that's what we're called to as followers of Jesus. And today, as we pick up in chapter 20 of Jesus' story, the mother of James and John, again, who's traveling with this whole caravan of people up to celebrate Passover, she's going to ask a question, and her question is going to reveal that she and her sons haven't quite latched onto this idea that leaders go last. In fact, theirs is the exact opposite idea. So we're going to look into this conversation, hopefully learn a couple things from it in the remainder of our time this morning. So first of all, we're going to look a little bit at what they were seeking. And James, John, their mom, they were seeking to be honored. They felt like that's what the goal of leadership is. That's kind of what the goal of life is, to work yourself into positions where you gain more and more honor. And surely that translates into God's kingdom and the way that we're supposed to live for him and the way that his kingdom works forever. Surely it's the same way. It says in verse 20, then the mother of Zebedee's sons approached him with her sons. And so again, the mom and the 2 boys, they're right there. She knelt down before Jesus to ask him something. In her mind, this is kind of a humble thing. She's kneeling down, maybe even bowing herself before Jesus on the ground because she's got this important request. And he says, what do you want? And she says, promise me that these 2 sons of mine, my boy James and my boy John, one of them can sit on your right and the other one can sit on your left in your kingdom. And she's asking for something very specific because the right side and the left side culturally mean very specific things. In fact, in the Greek language that the New Testament's written in, it really reveals what those things mean. Because the word that's used for right hand that the culture also uses for right or on the right side is the word that means to take hold of something or to have power. Okay, and so your right hand is connected with power. And so she's saying, can you give one of my sons like the second chair in command? Can he have the power, like the most power next to you, Jesus, in your kingdom? And the other one, can he be on the left? And the left side, the way that you would say left in first century Greek was you would say the word good name. And when you said good name, they knew that you meant the left side. Because the left side was like the favored side, the side that showed partiality. And so she's saying, can one of my sons get the power and then the other one get like your partial treatment, like your favoritism? Can my boys have those positions in your kingdom? Can they get the power and can they get the privileges in your kingdom? And she's actually asking Jesus, can you be partial to my kids? And if you know anything about God's character and God's nature, he kind of shies away from showing partiality to people. But again, James and John and their mom, they're thinking in the way that we think, the way that humans think in this world, not necessarily the way that God thinks. The other thing that I find kind of ironic is Jesus has actually already promised all of his 12 students authority. And we saw this in the last story that Jesus told about the guy that hires people to go into his vineyard. In fact, if you go to the next slide, you might remember this from last week. These are some of the seats of honor that are in some of the Greek stadiums around that region. And Jesus said, I plan on giving all 12 of you seats of honor in my kingdom, like the right to make decisions, the right to settle disputes over the tribes of Israel. So you're already getting these positions. But that wasn't good enough for James and John and their mom. They wanted to have the number 1 and number 2 chairs, not just one of 12 seats of honor. They want a little bit more honor. And Jesus says, you don't know what you're asking. And that word know, it means like you just don't perceive it. You're not connecting the dots in your mind. She doesn't perceive how contrary the way she's thinking is to the way that God thinks and the way that life with him and his community and his kingdom actually operates. She says, you don't quite get it. He's going to elaborate on the way things do work in just a few moments. But first he makes this statement to James and John. He says, are you both able to drink the cup that I'm about to drink? You think, well, that's kind of odd. I mean, you're hiking on a desert road. You have some cups available. You're taking a water break. What's going on here? And it's important to note that this is a Hebrew idiom. We have idioms in our culture. Here's a couple examples. I'm going to ask you what these idioms mean, and so if you know, just kind of respond. You can just respond out loud. Here's the first one. Beat around the bush. What's it mean to beat around the bush? You take your broom and you start walking around the bush and hitting the ground, right? If you translate it into other languages, that's what they think. What's it mean? You don't get to the point. You're kind of just dilly-dallying. That's another one, I guess. You're waiting around. You're kind of procrastinating. Oh, I don't really want to tell them the truth because I want to soften this. Here's another one. Bite the bullet. What's that mean? You take a bullet, you just stick it between your teeth, right? What's it mean?
Take one for the team.
Take one for the team. Yeah, any other thoughts on that? Suck it up. Right, yeah. Just deal with it. Yeah, deal with the pain. Take one for the team. How about this one? Break a leg. What? Good luck? How does that mean good luck? It just does, right? Because it's an idiom. And so drink from a cup is an idiom in Hebrew in the Jewish culture. And so to us, we're like, okay, they drank out of a cup. But for them, there's a little bit deeper meaning, and it portrays something. It portrays 3 things throughout the Bible. One is that you're undergoing an experience when you drink from a cup. Like, you're experiencing something. And so if somebody's drinking out of the same cup that you are, they're experiencing the same things that you're about to experience or that you've experienced. Another way of interpreting that with that idiom is facing a consequence. And this can be a good consequence or a bad one. So if you're drinking out of a cup, it might mean that the consequence is you're being blessed, or that you're being saved, or that you're receiving God's wrath or anger or punishment. But you're getting some consequence. And so if you're both drinking out of a cup, you're both getting the same consequence. And then the third idea is that you're entering into a covenant. And a covenant, we don't have really the closest concept in our culture to a covenant is what happens when people marry each other in our culture here. Because it's not necessarily that you're like you're signing up for a specific contract. You're entering into this relationship, and the relationship has some mutual agreements that you all agree toward. And so when you're drinking out of the same cup, you're saying, like, we're in some sort of relationship, and there's parameters on this. For example, Christine's not in here. I was going to call her up, and that would probably be embarrassing to her, but she's out with our 3-year-old, so she's probably glad that she was able to get around that one. But here's an example. So in marriage ceremonies, a lot of times if I conduct a wedding for somebody, I'll have the bride and the groom say something like this. I'll phrase something like this to them. Do you take so-and-so to be your husband or wife, to have and to hold, for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health? Do you promise to remain faithful as long as you both will live? Those are parameters on the relationship, right? If I am just in the bedroom puking my guts out because I have this stomach bug, we're still going to be together even though I'm not pleasant to be around right now. If we are in the poorhouse, like we're just scraping to get by, we're eating, a couple of McDonald's chicken nuggets because the pantry's bare, or we're just floating in cash, I'm going to be there with you, regardless of circumstances. Those are the parameters on the agreement, right? And so there's different covenants that the Bible describes as drinking out of a cup. And I think all those three different aspects of that metaphor are going to come into play here with what Jesus says. He says to his followers, James and John specifically, can you drink out of my cup? And he's saying, can you experience what I experience? Can you receive the consequences or endure the consequences that I'm going to endure? Can you become a part of this covenant relationship that I'm going to present or make possible to enter into? So there's three facets of it. I don't know if they see all this at the time, but they say, yeah, we can do it. We're able. I don't think they get quite the depth of what he's telling them. And he says, you will indeed drink my cup. You're going to experience some of the same persecution and hardships I experienced. You're going to experience some of the same blessings that I experienced, some of the same wrath of people that I experienced, and we're actually going to, in a few days, enter into this covenant relationship because my blood's going to be shed for you. I'm going to give my life on a cross, and that's going to make a whole new relationship with me, with God, possible. So yeah, you're going to drink from that cup. He tells them that, but he says to sit at my right and my left side, that's not mine to give. Instead, it's for those for whom it's been prepared by my Father. And so he says, God the Father, he's already prepared positions of honor for specific people in his kingdom. But he's not going to do it because somebody asked, and he's not going to do it because he's showing partiality or favoritism to people in the group. He's going to do it because that's the just thing to do, and God's going to make those decisions. That's not any person's right to ask for that. And so this conversation is going on the side, but remember, there's a caravan of people here, right? And so it's not like the side conversation is private. And there's 10 other students, 10 of the 12, that are in close proximity, and they hear this conversation. And how do you think they're going to react? How would you react? Let's say you have some brothers and sisters, and a couple brothers and sisters ask for, the lion's share of your parents' inheritance, and you're just standing right there. How do you respond? How does it make you feel? You jerk, what are you doing? We're just as important as you. And that's exactly the reaction that everyone's having here. It says, when the 10 disciples heard this, they became indignant. This is another Hebrew idiom, and the English translations don't translate it because we would look at it and go, what's that mean? Because it's a Hebrew idiom. And the idiom is, what they're actually saying is, it says, they became an ache in the arm. We have a saying called a pain in the neck. You know what a pain in the neck means, right? You're kind of being a jerk, right? You're irritating me, being a thorn in my side. And that's what they're saying here. They, all of a sudden, these people became a pain in the neck to them. And they were irritated at these two brothers. They were in pain because these guys are prideful jerks. And they're trying to put themselves first, and we're a tight-knit community of people, and that doesn't work in a tight-knit community of people. But how oftentimes do we try to put ourselves first in tight-knit communities of people? So isn't this us sometimes as well? And so Jesus is seeing this conflict start to brew, and he's seeing the arrogance that's happening kind of in James and John's heart, and the mom that's asking for things that she just doesn't quite perceive, the seriousness of, and how different that is from the way that God operates. And Jesus is going to respond and give everyone kind of a direction to go as a result of this conflict that's brewing. And the direction he's going to point them in is the direction of humility, which is a great direction for us to be pointed in as people. It says Jesus called them over. So he says, all right, you all are a community of people. There's a rift here. So why don't you all come on over? We need to have a conversation. We need to work this out. This is what he said. You know, or you notice, you see that the rulers of the Gentiles, the other cultures, the other nations that are surrounding you, they lord it over them. They bring people under their power. And those in high positions, the great people, they act like tyrants. They exercise their authority and their privilege over other people. So he says, let's just step back here and look at how humans operate. Look at how selfish human nature operates. And he uses the word rulers. And I think a lot of times in the Bible, there are these little key words that point us back to other places in Scripture. The first time that we hear about the word ruler or ruling in the Bible is actually Genesis chapter 1. It's the very beginning. And God actually, one of the things that distinguishes people, humans, in God's creation from everything else is that he specifically instructed the humans to rule over his creation, over the creatures, over the earth, not over each other as humans, but over this creation. And people distorted that. Sin distorted that. And it became more of a selfishly intentioned ruling and exercise of power instead of one that was for the good of his creation. And this is what happened as a result. We see in that verse, in verse 25, Jesus pull out different aspects, and this is really what he pulls out. One, people get trampled over. These rulers in the other cultures, they're lording their power over people. And so initially, people were supposed to care for God's creation and to care for each other, but instead they're just walking all over each other. And the other cultures, they're using power to assert control over other people. So it's all about, if I get enough power, then I can be in control. And because of that, getting the higher position in life becomes the goal. And we think, like, for me, at first I was so easy for me to put this on other people, but then I think about how our culture works here, even in the United States currently. Or maybe if you're from a different culture in this room or watching online, your culture maybe has aspects of this as well. But how does our culture, does it not sometimes trample on other people, use people to elevate us? Does it not desire power to be in control in some way? I mean, even us, I think about myself and my role in our family, like as a dad even. Do I want to control what my children do so that things go easier on me and I have less stress? You know, where is my heart really at? Do positions become the highest goal? How do careers work in America? Do people try to work up the ladder? Do you try to get better benefits and higher pay and more authority over people? Is that the way that our society, just humanity in general, kind of gravitates? And then the last thing that Jesus points out here, like, people want to exercise their privileges. Like, we pursue different privileges so that we gain advantages, because nobody likes to be disadvantaged in life. Nobody likes to struggle. Nobody likes to, be in debt. Nobody likes to be in pain. Nobody likes to be have physical issues or limitations. And so we all try to get into a more privileged position so that we can have an advantageous life instead of one that involves suffering. And how true these things are, even of the way that humanity, for the most part, operates today. And then Jesus says, like, I've called you here, you've looked at the way that society operates, but he says it in verse 26, it must not be this way among you. On the contrary. So life with me has to kind of revert to the way that you were created to be in the first place. The type of ruling that God intended in Genesis chapter 1 before sin and humanity going its own way kind of wrecked things and corrupted our nature as people. It's got to go back to that. He says, on the contrary, whoever wants to become great among you will become your servant. Will become, so it's a process. And that word servant has the idea of like your table waiter, your attendant, your caregiver. It's a humble position. So Jesus is steering them away from self and into this view of serving other people in life, into humility. And I put this next statement, I put it up on the notes, and this is kind of my best attempt to like reframe the way that the other cultures viewed life and the goals of life into the way that Jesus' kingdom would kind of see it at this point in time, but also in our point in time too. It's kind of like in God's kingdom, service is a lifestyle. If there's one lifestyle that followers of Jesus should be characterized by, it's a lifestyle of service. And it's really the opposite of what comes most natural to us as humans. It's embracing the role of a table waiter, an attendant, or a caregiver. It's putting everybody else first, which I tell you does not come natural for me at all. It's empowering other people instead of wanting to be in the position of making all the decisions or being in control myself. It's letting go and letting other people thrive and other people have responsibility. It's elevating other people, wanting them to be honored instead of me, giving them opportunity. it's encouraging other people, and it's giving other people an edge at my own expense. How can I promote them? How can I give them a better opportunity? Even if it's going to cost me, it's going to humble me, I'm going to miss out on something. Totally different than the way that we are wired. Our human nature is wired. It's also cultivating the earth and everything in it, which was part of our original intention when God created us as rulers. So it's the world, the nature, the creatures that are in it. It's improving and cultivating and making more productive that world as well. So Jesus is asking us to completely rethink what it means to be human. Kind of like a new way, a restored way to be human, but the way that God actually created us to live in the first place. He says this is service, and this is what you have to embrace if you want to truly lead in God's kingdom. He says, verse 27, and whoever wants to be first among you will be your slave. Just a restatement of if you want to be first, you've got to be last. He's saying in God's kingdom, the most honored people will live like slaves. What do you think the life of a slave might look like in God's kingdom? I don't know. I mean, we've experienced slavery, unfortunately, in our society here in America in different points in time. Roman society sure was filled with it, in Greek society at this point in time in the first century. But I think as far as like framing slavery in a way that we can grasp as followers of Jesus, what does that look like in Jesus' kingdom? There's a statement that the Apostle Paul makes in 1 Corinthians 4. And I think that gives us the best window that I've found into what this looks like. Like, what does it look like to be a slave in God's kingdom? This is what Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 4. And he's talking to the Corinthians who are kind of prideful, who are kind of where James and John are at, and James and John's mother are at here, wanting to elevate themselves. And this was what he says to the Corinthians at that point in time. He says, you're already full. You are already rich. You have begun to reign as kings without us. And I wish you did reign so that we could also reign with you. So you're kind of seeking power in the way that the world seeks power. Like you're doing well because you're elevating yourself. And then he says, I think God has displayed us, the apostles, in last place. Like humans condemned to die. We have become a spectacle to the world, both to angels and to people. We are fools for Christ, but you come across as so wise. We are weak, but you Corinthians, you're strong. You're distinguished, but we are dishonored. Up to the present hour, we're hungry, we're thirsty, we're poorly clothed, we're roughly treated, we're homeless, we labor working with our own hands to make a living. When we're reviled, we bless. When we're persecuted, we endure it. When we're slandered, we respond graciously. Even now, we're like the scum of the earth. We get treated like everyone's garbage. And that was the result of the Apostle Paul living like a slave. He said, I've become the servant to everyone, and the world has run me over for it. Because the world is pursuing self and all those other things. And Paul was going a completely opposite direction, and the world was more than happy to just run over him. You think, well, I don't want a life like that. But Jesus is saying, if you want to represent me well, and if you want to be honored in God's kingdom, that's really your goal. Your goal is to humble yourself. Then he uses this phrase. He says, exactly like the Son of Man, the Son of humanity, he's referring to himself, did. He did not come to be served, but he came to serve. If you look at Jesus over and over and over and over again, he shows us what a life of serving and loving people is like. That was his point. So he's setting himself up as that example to us. He didn't ask anything of us that he wasn't willing to do to a greater degree. And to give his life as a ransom for many. And that word life, it's got three nuances. It's your life, like your days, your time, your hours. It's your breath, so every breath. And it's also your soul. And he gave up all those things. He even gave up his life in death, it says. He did that to become a ransom for many. And we'll close with a quick comment on what the ransom means in just a moment. So basically, Jesus himself, who's God with us, according to Matthew, he becomes our ultimate example of sacrifice and humility. And He calls himself the Son of Humanity, which is what Ezekiel, the book of Ezekiel, God calls Ezekiel Son of Man 94 times in the book of Ezekiel. So that's our frame of reference for that title of Jesus, Son of Man. And it emphasizes the fact that Jesus, he came to endure suffering and opposition, just like Ezekiel the prophet did. He says, I came to give my life. So he's going to pay, even with his very soul, his very breath being extinguished on the cross. And then he came as a ransom. And the idea behind that, that's a reference back to Leviticus in some of these offerings. One of the offerings that Moses talks about at the beginning of the book of Leviticus, these sacrifices that were offered at the temple in Jerusalem, eventually these animal sacrifices, Moses describes in Leviticus 1, 3, and 4. And this is what Moses says. This is a sacrifice that Jesus is comparing himself to. Moses says if his offering, the thing that brings him near is what the word offering means, like you bring it there so that you can get nearer to God through it. If it's a burnt offering, which means a smoke offering from the herd, he's to bring an unblemished male animal. He'll bring it to the entrance of the tent of meeting so that he may be accepted by the Lord. He's to lay his hand on the head of the burnt offering so it can be accepted on his behalf to make atonement for him. That word atonement, it's two different concepts. One is a ransom payment, like you owe a debt, and that thing pays your debt. And the other one is that you're unclean, and it makes you clean, it purifies you. So that those concepts are represented by atonement. And so as you would bring this animal, it would be fully consumed. Its life would be turned to smoke, and it would rise up before God. And before it was, you put your hand on it, and that was to convey this animal represents me. So it's going up in smoke. Its innocent life is rising before God so that I can be brought near and I can be accepted. And Jesus is comparing himself with that sacrifice. He's saying, my life is about to go up in smoke and rise up before the Father in heaven so that I can represent you and so that I can make a way for you to be accepted by God and brought near to God. I'm about to do that for you. I will be the ultimate example of sacrifice. I'll never ask you to do anything more than what I'm already willing to do for you. What an amazing challenge, but what an impression that conversation would make. I would think on James, John, their mother, the other 10, and even on us 2,000 years later to hear that and be challenged toward that type of humility. So as we go from here, I just want to give you a few directions you might head as far as a way to respond to this or reflect on this story more. One, maybe ask yourself, you can go to the next slide if you want, it's just got some summaries here. Oh, I don't have it on there. Okay, excellent. So, first of all, I think it's in the back of your bulletin. If you want to pull that out, you can, and just refer to those things. But first of all, how has God spoken to you or stirred your emotions through what Jesus has shared this story this morning? It's probably different for different individuals, but how has God spoken to you, or what emotions has he evoked in your life? What did you notice about God and who he is? So think about the God aspect. And then think about yourself, you do some self-reflection as well. Questions you might ask: how do you secretly hope Jesus will show partiality to you and your family members? I mean, I think about some of the things we pray for. God, make our life easy and comfortable and pain-free and, heal us and help us to have plenty of money and all these things, And do I want God to be partial to me in those ways? How have you been attempting to put yourself first in your tight-knit communities of people? James and John did that. We fall into the same trap, I think, of wanting ourselves to have it better than other people in our community instead of looking out for their interests. And then fifth, I put these different roles of a servant, just kind of a recap of that on the back of the bulletin. How can you embrace the role of a table waiter or attendant or caregiver? How can you put someone else first? How can you empower, elevate, or encourage somebody in your life? How can you give somebody else an edge, even at your expense? What's something you can do to cultivate the earth or a creature or a resource that inhabits it, to kind of rule in the way that God, again, originally intended? And then the final question, will you drink from Jesus' cup? Will you drink from it? Maybe it's the experiences. Maybe it's the consequences. Maybe it's just entering into that covenant, that relationship with him through faith, believing in him as God in the flesh, who is your sacrifice, the one who can bring you near and allow you to approach God. That's drinking from his cup. So maybe that's an invitation for you today as well.